What is the scariest story you know that is 100% true? Was working the evening shift at a gas station. Man comes in all disoriented. I go to help him out. He has a gash on his head and doesn't know where he was. I couldn't see any crashes around, so assumed he had fallen or something. Normally we are supposed to stay inside the glass-shielded register area, whenever anyone is in the store. I, being a nice human being, went to help, while calling the police/EMS. They got there and checked him out. They thought his head may have been fractured. Took him to the ER. I went back to work. Cops stopped back by, for some coffee a few hours later. They told me the guy got hit by a baseball bat trying to break into a little girl's bedroom, and was wanted for rape and murder, in 2 other states. I never left the register area at night again. The Lake Newest disaster. The lake periodically belches a cloud of invisible carbon dioxide gas, that suffocates everything within a 16-mile radius. In 1986, over 1,700 people and all their livestock died, without even understanding what was happening to them. My science teacher in high school was in the Peace Corps, and one of the first people to come across this village, after it happened. He said it was so eerie, because all the flies and mosquitoes had died, and it was so silent. The story of Mary Vincent always stands out to me. In 1978, 15-year-old Mary was hitchhiking. A man named Lawrence Singleton picked her up. He brutally raped her, and eventually made her get out of the car. She planned to run, but he noticed, and cut both her arms off. He threw her into a ditch/ravine and left her to die. She packed her stumps with mud, to stop the bleeding, and spent all night crawling out. She eventually makes it to the highway and starts walking, naked, and covered in blood. The first car that saw her sped away in fear. The second car was a couple on their honeymoon. They picked her up and she survived. Edited to add, I was in a rush when I wrote this, so you should definitely read more into the story. It's crazy. From the horrific act itself, to the court proceedings, to the fact that he hardly served any time. John List killed his whole family, wife, mother, daughter and 2 sons. He meticulously planned the whole thing, canceling all delivery services, excusing the kids from school, and even turned the air conditioning as low as possible, to preserve the bodies for as long as possible. After he killed them all, he placed the bodies in sleeping bags and lined them up. He then wrote a letter to his pastor, explaining why he had to kill them. He then leaves and isn't heard from again. 18 years later he's remarried and doing the same job as before, but this time he doesn't have any children. He's finally arrested after a tip was given to the FBI. Crazy thing is, that because he planned it so well, the bodies weren't discovered until a month after the murders, so he had a huge head start, and essentially started a new life in the same career and was heavily involved in a new church down in Virginia. Took 18 years to capture him. What did the letter say that he left? He pretty much explained that he killed his family to ensure their entry into heaven, because he was worried they were straying from their faith. So in a way, he thought he was saving their souls. One of my friends had someone following her home, hiding in the bushes, so they couldn't be seen. She booked it to her house, got inside, and he was watching the house from the outside. She called the cops. They come along quietly and got the jump on him. He had condoms, handcuffs, and a knife. When they got his DNA, it turned out that he was linked to a half-dozen rapes in the area. She credits her regimen of running sprints to outrunning him that night, and firmly believes she would have been raped if she couldn't outrun him then. In my town in the early 90s there was a notorious killer that had all of British Columbia, Canada on watch. My wife's mother, years and years before I knew them, had been home, alone while her husband was in England doing tree surgeon work, arborist. She was in her laundry room, when a man walked up from her basement, completely scaring her. She freaked out and said, "What the hell are you doing here?" He said he was friends with her husband, and was just coming to see if he was here. Apparently he told him he could just walk in. Which she knew was bullshit. She was smart enough to tell him that he was just at the store and would be back any minute. He said he would wait outside for him. As soon as he left she called the police, but he was long gone by the time they got here. 2 weeks later, the killer was caught. His mugshot put on TV and it was the guy in her house. Edit, the guy's name was Terry Driver. Here's a link to his wiki. My family has a similar story and I'm pretty sure some of you serial killer buffs out there might figure out who it is before the reveal, because their story is pretty unique. When my parents were in college they went on a trip down to Florida. They had met through mutual friends, and were down there together but hadn't gone on a date yet. My dad and one of his friends were planning to meet my mom and some of her friends at a hotel, but being the carefree college guys, they lost track of time and realized it was impossible to get to the hotel on time by walking. They decided the best solution to their problem was to hitchhike, and a car with 2 women picked him up. Everything seemed fine, until the driver asked them if it was okay to stop for gas. My dad and his friend agreed it was no problem, since they were making good time, and she drove into a gas station. She then pumped her car full of gas before hopping back in and flooring it, basically stealing the gas with 2 hitchhikers in the back. My dad and his friend were beginning to freak out, when she pulled a gun from under her seat and asked, "Are we gonna have a problem or something like that?" My dad and his friend shook their heads vehemently, because what else do you do in that situation? She then drove them to the hotel and dropped them off, without so much as a scratch, and they kinda thought nothing of it, until the news started reporting on a serial killer in Florida, known as Aileen Wuornos. He took one look at her picture and instantly recognized her as the driver. The only reason my dad thinks she didn't straight up kill them was because they were super polite and respectful to her, and her victims were usually scumbag guys trying to take advantage of her. DL, Dr. Aileen Wuornos is the reason my dad got to his first date with mom on time. My dad and some friends got drunk, and went for a drive on some back roads and were going as fast as the truck would go as teenagers. My dad was slightly less drunk than the others, and eventually demanded they let him get out. They pulled over, and he and one other girl got out. He and the girl started walking to town while the other 3 sped off in the opposite direction. Well, less than a mile up the road from where they got out is an extremely sharp turn, which they missed and hit a tree going pretty close to triple digits miles per hour. 2 of them died on impact, and the only reason the third survived is because they crashed in front of a house that 2 doctors lived in. The survivor was paralyzed and lost his leg and part of his arm and was in the hospital for 8 months before dying. This was in the 60s, so medical care wasn't what it is today. When I first got my permit, my dad took me to that corner to explain the importance of safe driving. It gave me goosebumps about how close he was to being in the truck. He said that the dad of the driver got what remained of the truck to be hung up in the center of town for months after, to be a warning to all. That's terrifying. I missed a situation like this years ago. Was hanging out with a buddy at the bars, and we leave to go back to his place for some smoke and video games. His roommate comes home from work, he was a bartender, and tells us he's heading out to the bars and asks if we want to go. He'll drive. We go back and forth but eventually decide to stay in. Turns out, the buddy had been drinking heavily at work, but we couldn't tell. He ended up flipping his Jeep off of an overpass and dropping 20+ feet. The entire back of his Jeep, where I would have been sitting, was crushed into the back of the front seat. The roll bar was smashed into the passenger side. Buddy ended up getting some serious brain injuries and spent the next few years learning how to walk and talk again. He's still pretty off, and much different than he used to be. My other buddy and I came very close to a similar or worse fate. This is a hometown story that stayed with me. It happened literally right around the corner from where I grew up, maybe a 2-minute drive away. Judy Kirby murdered 6 children and 1 adult by intentionally driving the wrong way, on a divided highway, in an attempt to commit S. She had been hospitalized for depression, but had also just ended a relationship with her ex-husband's brother and was by some reports involved in drug trafficking and fearing an imminent arrest. She picked up her sister's son, who was celebrating his 10th birthday that day. She then loaded her 3 children into the car, supposedly to pick up a gift for the nephew. Instead, she went missing with the carload of kids. A short time later, calls started coming into 911, about a car going the wrong way down the highway at a high rate of speed. They made it about 90 seconds before a head-on collision with another vehicle, driven by a father with 2 children and another child, along for the ride. The crash annihilated both vehicles. The only survivors were Kirby herself, and the child who was along for the ride, in the other car. There were pieces of children all over the highway. She was sentenced to 215 years in prison. This sounds exactly like the story of There's Something Wrong with Aunt Diane, another real-life event, where a woman drove a van full of children down the wrong way while being high on some drug before eventually hitting another car and killing herself and the kids. Really odd the similarities between Judy Kirby and Diane Schuler's cases. Edit, had forgotten the details of Diane's case, but she had apparently been horribly drunk, empty handle of vodka found at the scene, plus blood alcohol content, twice the legal limit in autopsy, and had tested positive for THC in her system. Years ago when I was 8, my family lived in this big weird house kind of on the edge of a small town. The school district was in the middle of a big restructuring, so even though we were only a couple grades apart, my brother and I went to different schools and took different buses. This left me as the last person to leave in the morning and the first person to get home in the afternoon, which meant it was my job to make sure all the lights were off and the door was locked. One morning I noticed the basement door was open and the light was on, so before I left I turned off the light and closed the door. When I got home that afternoon the light was on and the door was open again. I just assumed that I'd forgotten to actually take care of it when I noticed it in the morning, so I went over to turn off the light and close the door. When I got to the top of the basement stairs, I looked and there was a big shadowy male figure towards the bottom of the staircase. I freaked out, slammed the door and pushed a bunch of boxes against it, and then went and hid in my closet. For months, I didn't tell my family, because I was positive what I had seen was a ghost, and didn't think anyone would believe me. Then about a year after that incident my mom and her boyfriend realized that small amounts of money had been going missing for months, totaling around $800 to $900, but never more than $60 at once. So, we all walked around the house, with flashlights, trying to figure out how they could have gotten in. Turns out some creep was climbing in through a small hole in the outside of the house, shimmying through a crawl space, then coming up into the house through the basement. Realizing I had been alone in the house with him, on at least one occasion, was one of the worst, most terrifying moments I've ever had. Edit: whoa, this blew up way more than I expected. I'm doing my best to respond to comments/questions, sorry if I end up missing yours. My brother's ex-GF had two older sisters, they died before she was born. One day they decided to play hide and seek or something, so anyway, they both climbed inside a chest and accidentally locked themselves in. They suffocated. That is terrifying. It's particularly terrifying to me, because I remember, when I was younger something similar almost happened to me and my cousin. She had a daybed, and we decided to get behind it and push it against the wall so we could play and nap in the dark. It got unbearably hot, and we realized we couldn't breathe after about 30 minutes. If it wouldn't have also gotten so hot from our fear/body heat/lack of oxygen, we might have actually suffocated, because we were getting lightheaded. It was scary, but eventually we pulled the bed away from the wall. I have no idea how that could happen on carpet. Bizarre freak accidents are just so strange. I'm truly sorry for you brother's ex-GF. Edit: the bed. Tough to pick just one, because there is true evil in humanity out there. Stuff like the Blood Eagle ritual is pretty awful. But in terms of really scary, probably stuff that just kind of happens on accident. Like the story of Kyle Plush. Just awful. He was in a minivan that has one of those back seats that you can push backward to lay flat in the trunk, for extra storage space. He went to grab something in the trunk, leaning over the seat, and it tipped backward and pinned him, upside down, against the back of the car in a position such that he couldn't get himself out. He called the police twice. The second time he called and gave them a very clear description of the car. Plush called 911 again at around 3:35 p.m. Police said this time, he provided a description of the vehicle as he desperately pleaded for help, but couldn't hear the dispatcher. Isaac said, the information didn't get relayed to officers at the scene. This is not a joke, the teen said over 911. I'm almost dead. He asked the dispatcher to tell my mom I love her, if I die. Just a horrible, random accident that could have happened to anybody. This kid didn't go looking for trouble, like he didn't try and go down a chimney or go caving like other people who have gotten stuck and suffocated. He was just reaching for something in his trunk, got pinned, and then was not found in time. Nightmarish for the kid and his family. Nutty Putty Cave, in Utah, was sealed up in 2009, after John Jones was trapped upside down, in a small crevice, while spelunking. When rescue teams finally arrived, he had been upside down for so long, that his legs were drained of blood. The only possible way to have gotten him out, was to break his legs, which would have sent him into fatal shock. He died after being trapped for 28 hours. His body's still in the cave. I'll tell you one that happened to me, or rather, I was witness to. One night, I was out at a bar with a friend I was visiting, in New Rochelle, New York. We went outside for a cigarette, and a car came flying past the bar. The car burned through a red light, and started going up this hill that was on a curve. We watched, as he veered over the double yellow, and smashed head-on with another car coming from the other direction. Both cars' hind ends lifted up, then slammed down. The car that was driving correctly burst into flames. I ran inside and grabbed the fire extinguisher, then yelled to the bartender to call 911, and say, there has been an accident. My friend, a few other patrons, and me ran to the cars. Now, I used to think this was a fictional trope, but I was pretty drunk before this happened, and I swear it sobered me up instantly. I tried spraying the fire, but it did nothing. The fumes and heat were awful, and all we could do was stand back. The worst part was, and this will haunt me forever, was that the woman in the burning car was screaming as she died. My God, it was the worst sound ever. The fire department came and put the fire out. The police took us back to the bar and took statements. I found out the next day in the news that the car that was not speeding was being driven by a young woman coming home late from work. She was a block away from home, and I think she was either newly married or a new mother. The rotten mother trucker driving the other car was some rich drunk cocksucker. He lost a leg, but otherwise was physically unharmed. I have no clue if he did time, as I left to go back home a day or so later. I'm trying to find a link for the news story, but I can't, as this was maybe 6 or 7 years back. I remember it being reported on Lohud and Channel 12 News. Years ago, my now husband worked for an industrial laundry company in their head office when a PR disaster happened that also mentally screwed up a number of people. Their company collected laundry from large hospitals and medical-type businesses, example care homes etc., and cleaned them. You can imagine the sort of heavy-duty cleaning, bleaching, boiling etc. needed to remove those sort of biological contaminants. One day, a laundry cart went through the usual bleaching boiling cycle, before it dropped out into a conveyor belt, to be sorted for drying/pressing, when there was a horrid scream. A small newborn baby's body had been discovered, tangled up amongst the sheets. It had been cooked. The laundry workers were distraught. The whole place had to be shut down, police called, and the laundry tracked back to the hospital to discover what happened. It turns out thankfully in some ways, stillborn baby had been left in the cot, waiting to be taken down to the hospital mortuary, after the parents had said their goodbyes and covered it with a blanket, but somehow, one of the nurses hadn't realized, just on shift was the best guess, so just grabbed up all the linen out the cot and off the bed, in the delivery room, with the body bundled inside, and emptied it into the laundry hamper/trolley thing. The other nurses/parents assumed the baby had been collected by the mortuary, to be stored, awaiting their funeral decisions. The laundry was found not to be to blame, but the parents were devastated, and the hospital took a lot of flack. The poor laundry workers, who discovered the body, ended up being given counseling, before eventually quitting. The laundry did amend its practice, to individually emptying each laundry hamper into the industrial machines, instead of just tipping them in, to stop anything like that happening again. Edit, just found it in the newspaper. Turns out, I misremembered the how of getting into the laundry basket slightly wrong. My wife arrived at her parents' house, that she was currently living in due to health issues of her father's. She got into the house, no one else was there at the time, and instead of going further in, stopped in the first room that held the computers, which was right by the door. She went into the room and was messing around on the internet, when one of the cats came into the room. Her cat, to be precise. Well, this cat was super laid back. Loved everyone and never picked fights or got aggressive. He would literally lay down and let squirrels throw pecans at him from trees and do nothing but take it. Not tonight, however. Tonight he was growling and hissing intermittently while standing between my wife and the entrance to the rest of the house. A laid-back sweet old cat was acting like he was going to rip out a throat. Well, my wife decided that this was really effing weird, so she picked up her cat and left the house. Lo and behold, she sees a cop car patrolling down her street and flagged them down. She explained the situation and they demanded, that she stay in their cruiser, while they both checked it out. Turns out they found the back door wide open, super bad. Her parents and her never leave the door unlocked, much less open. She came to find out later, from those cops, that they were hunting down a serial rapist that had been spotted in the area, and that was why they were rolling down a safe, normally, residential street. Super spooky. Life pro tip? Always trust the cat. Happened to me, have posted about it before. I was around 11 years old, and I woke up in the middle of the night, to a man straddled on top of me, with his hand over my mouth and nose. He told me to roll over and not scream. I rolled onto the floor and tried to scream. Bloody murder, I say tried, cause when you are truly terrified it can take a second to find your voice. My mom heard me screaming and came in, and fought with the guy. He was at least 6 feet, she was 5 feet 3 inches, and scared him enough, with the fighting and screaming, that he took off out the window he had come in through. Never did catch him. Have you heard of the Nazis so bad that other Nazis, in particular fellow SS Nazis, constantly tried to get him, and his unit disbanded, and arrested? No? Well, his name was Oscar Dirlewanger, and his unit was nicknamed, the Black Hunters or the Dirlewanger Brigade. Oscar Dirlewanger was an early adopter of the Nazi Party. He had been thrown in jail before, for being a pedo. Eventually, when World War II broke out, and healthy ideal Germans were dying in droves on the Eastern Front, Oscar's old pal, Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, granted him a command of a unit, made up originally of German poachers, and eventually German criminals being held in civilian jails, camps, and military criminals. His unit was essentially designated as a rearguard unit, meant to hunt down enemy partisans, or in most cases, civilians in occupied countries. Oscar Dirlewanger, SS unit, was responsible for many atrocities. Some atrocities so barbaric and bad, other SS units reported him and his unit for atrocities. A few examples, which have been popularized in film, include taking an entire village in Belarus and putting them in a church, locking the doors, and setting the church ablaze. Anyone who tried to escape was shot by machine guns and rifles. This unit raped, tortured, and murdered its way through Eastern and Central Europe. During the Warsaw Uprising, they were sent to help squelch the uprising. One of their atrocities committed was going into a children's hospital, telling the nurses and staff that they were there to secure the church. Okay. Once the church was secured, they raped the female staff, and some of the wounded and sick female children victims, and then went around shooting everyone. If anyone was found to have survived, they were bayoneted. These guys were so horrible, that other Nazis looked down their noses at them, and constantly filed complaints and reports against them, but with no real success. Thankfully, by the end of the war, this unit was destroyed, and its leaders and criminal soldiers were hunted down, like rabid animals. Told this here before, but once more. My friend had this neighbor who was a retired mechanic. They lived on some properties with large front lawns and long driveways. His neighbor had a couple derelict cars parked up near his garage, that he took parts from occasionally. This neighbor of his started hearing noises while sitting in his living room, coming from his front yard. Every time he'd go to the window, there would be nothing there. He assumed it was a raccoon or a coyote or whatever. He kept hearing the noise, so he'd go outside to look around, but would find nothing. He'd put out traps and occasionally catch something, yet the noise persisted. Soon, he started claiming that he was hearing voices coming from the front yard, like whispering. He'd go outside and look around the perimeter of his property, but would find nothing. It was persistent, so he'd started calling the cops. Every time the cops came and looked around and would find nothing. So they told him, he needed to stop calling them for this, and perhaps get a security camera or whatever. So this guy thought he was losing his mind. One summer evening he couldn't sleep, so he went to the back patio to smoke a cigarette. Suddenly, he heard voices coming from the front of his house. He put his cig out and snuck around to the front, and got there just in time to see the doors to his derelict conversion van silently shut. He ran back to the backyard and went inside his home and called the police to tell them what he had seen. The police arrived and approached cold, i.e. without lights/sirens, and when they approached the van, the doors swung open and a bunch of people ran out in every direction. Upon searching the van, the cops found syringes and paraphernalia, and determined that people were shooting up in there. I worked for U-Haul when I was 18, and it was located in front of a club that was known for being really sketchy. I came in to open one morning, and it was common for people to knock on the door hoping to get in early and get their truck. On this day, I hear frantic knocking on the door. I'm there alone still, so it kind of startled me. I look and there's a woman, completely naked, covered in what looks like blood. I called the cops and grabbed one of the moving blankets, and went outside to cover her up. She smelled really bad and was a mess. Ended up being blood and her own shit she was covered in. Found out later, she was drugged at the club that night/early morning, raped and left blacked out in the alley. It was just a f up and surreal situation to be involved in. I was in a crappy motel. The room had bed bugs. I was too exhausted to go to the front desk. I just needed to make it until the morning. I slept in the tub. Hours later, I hear someone breaking through the window. I had a big knife with me and ran out into the room, to find a man halfway through my window. We stared for a while at each other in shock. I think we both were scared. Then he says, "Is this your room?" I am like, "Yes, this is my room, man." More staring. Then he slowly starts backing out, while cursing me for leaving my window unlocked and not expecting him to break in. Motel on Watt Avenue, Sacramento.